the hardest slot of the day. So we started the day talking about tools, and we had some culture talks. And for the last talk of the day, I want to talk a little bit about the future. So this is DevOps in a post-DevOps world. So who am I? I'm Paul Reed. I go by the Sober Build Engineer, Twitter, Sober Build Eng. I have 15 years experience as a build release engineer, so I come from the more the ops side of the house. I know there are people asking, are there other ops people? Are there other build engineers here? Probably not. I've been a DevOps consultant for the last few of those years. We'll laugh about that in a moment. And as you can see, if you're curious about where the nickname came from, you can actually ask me at the bar for the story. It's kind of funny. If my voice sounds a little familiar, we have a podcast called The Ship Show. Those are my co-hosts. They're great. You can check us out at theshipshow.com. So in conversations with friends and colleagues at conferences, I've started hearing some murmuring about, has DevOps jumped the shark? Which may seem like an odd question to ask, especially after everything we've talked about today. So, obviously DevOps is going gangbusters. If you search Google for DevOps, you're going to get 16 million hits. You've got your tools up there, your DevOps in a box, all of these things. And which might lead you to think it's about the tools. So, you can obviously download DevOps. It's easy as that. Make sure your tool is developed by DevOps. From DevOps to DevOps, I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Is that like some kind of Inception reference or something? I did want to note one of the vendors, and I won't tell you which one, on the page talks about their DevOps tool, and if you click on the link and search for the phrase DevOps in the resulting page, you don't get anything. So it's like some weirdness there. Okay, so maybe it's not about the tools. Maybe it's about the company culture. You can search DevOps and jobs listing. You'll see there's 4,499 exactly DevOps jobs, apparently. If you're not sure, you can get DevOps certified, the complete certification kit. It's on Amazon. It's $300. Because we all know that tomorrow's jobs are DevOps jobs. If you're having trouble, you want to make sure you get your terminology right. So if you're looking for ops dev engineers, you're going to have not as many search results. You're going to be wondering where the crowd is. And of course, if you're having a problem with your tooling, maybe your tool is too static. Your DevOps tool is too static. You want a dynamic DevOps tool. And then, so recruiters are loving this, right? And I got this ping from a recruiter, and he said, the definition of DevOps is an elusive one indeed. And I'm like, great, the recruiter's they're gonna help me understand what's going on here. But anyways, one of our clients in downtown San Francisco, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, okay, maybe not. And DevOps is like one of the fastest growing segments of the entire economy, apparently. If you search for DevOps, you'll get a hit in this is LinkedIn, obviously, for an executive chef for the UCSF Medical Center. I've heard of infrastructure as code, but I've never heard of food as code. And then, of course, if you go to devops.info, which Patrick Dubois actually registered, used to have a lot of info there, it's now a bed and breakfast in Belgium, I think. So we have our own bed and breakfast now. Sometimes I just feel like I'm the kid in that picture. I can't DevOps anymore. I just can't do it when I see stuff like that. And in all seriousness, a lot of companies, they're trying to help their customers understand and embrace the whole DevOps movement and react. And they're reacting in the shift in the market, to the shift in the marketplace. And I understand that. So it's, and that's good, right? Because it brings more people into the fold. But sometimes I just see something and it just makes me wonder, are we jumping the shark here? So before we can actually discuss Have we jumped the shark? Are we jumping the shark? It's good to have a working definition if we're going to talk about DevOps, of what DevOps is. And I saw it, I think, in Bridget's presentation. John Willis, quite elegantly, I think, actually defined it as CAMs, culture, automation, metrics, and sharing. If you're unfamiliar with the post, you can read it there. It's actually 2010. It's an old post. But here's what I never really understood. We had all of these things for a long time. I mean, the Mythical Man Month and Death March, the Mythical Man Month was published in 1975, and again in 1995. Death March, 1997, 20 years of Perl books in automation, if you don't like Shell. CVS, man, open source, development of CVS. CF Engine was released in the late 90s. Anyone remember MRTG? Yeah, MRTG, awesome, graph everything. And then on the sharing side, we had the GPL, we had Usenix, we had Lugs, Linux. Remember Linux user groups? People do that. So what made DevOps pop? What made it resonate with everyone in like the last 5 years, 3 years? Well, to look at that, I think it's useful to take the derivative. And if you don't like calculus, which is me, another way to say it is take a look at a meta-look at why did DevOps pop in the way that it did. So I submit to you that if we solve this equation, we get this. VIDS. CAMS, VIDS. Which stands for value realignment, individuality, don't be an asshole, and self-awareness. So let's talk about what these 4 things mean. So value realignment. What I'm not talking about the Bitcoin crash, although I do think that's an interesting graph. What we're really talking about is looking at value and its generation, and including things that detract from that value. So in the example we've heard a number of times where you've got developers installing things differently, that's just a waste of work and time ultimately, and that detracts from value. And it includes everyone and their activities within the organization in that particular calculation. And then part of that too is mapping its flow within the organization, and you'll hear that referred to often as the value stream. So it may seem like business majory stuff, but the quintessential example that we always hear of developers throwing stuff over the wall to ops, that's really tracking the value and the value that's lost in doing that, and the developers go home, and ops has to deal with that mess and getting it working, and that lost value that they're having to repeat so much of that work. It's really just looking at the value and looking at how it's flowing through that organization. It's also an acknowledgement that this sort of attitude does not work. The developer is king attitude. And I know there are a lot of developers here. But, this talk about ascending to the throne and getting the royal treatment and all of that, this is the wrong attitude. And we've realized this. Because no matter how good your software is or how compelling your software is, if you don't have someone responsible for operating it, or if you still ship it, someone's responsible for building and releasing it, it does not matter. Anyone remember the Amazon outages? So this resonates with everyone who isn't a developer, bringing up the point that it's not just developers anymore that are creators of value. Lots of people are involved in that process. And everyone is responsible for it. All right, next up, individuality. So I do not mean that, by this I don't mean that everyone is a unique snowflake, even though we all are. What I actually mean is individuality in this context. So this is something called the Cynefin framework. It's a Welsh word, so it's spelled kind of weird, and it's hard to pronounce, at least for me. I always mess it up. But it's a sense-making framework, and it's basically a way to look at a situation before when you just have data and you can't put it into categories because you don't really know what those categories would be. So I want to ask a question. Who here would describe their work or their software that they're working on writing as simple? Would anyone? I see one person going like this, so I'm going to say no. It's sort of simple. And the reason I ask that is because that means that we all operate in this complex and complicated space. And the reason that I point that out is because if you're in this complicated and complex space, the decision-making that you make fall under good practice, not best practice. And in fact, best practices are legitimate in the simple domain, but they're illegitimate in all of the others. And in fact, the guy who came up with this, he said, forcing best practice on people when good practice is what's called for will, and I quote him, piss people off because and cause them to avoid best practices entirely. And I've actually been trying to change my language with clients, because we're so tied to this idea of best practices. And even with developers, we don't call it that. In fact, the next slide is Hacker News, right? You're doing it wrong. And it's the idea that when we're working in complicated and complex systems, there is no best practice. Best is superlative. It means there's one. There are certainly bad practice, but we're working in space where there are good practices. There are multiple reasonable solutions to the outcome based on data we generally don't have, which is why Hacker News threads can be so infuriating to read. Because most of the time, these people don't have the data that we might have when we ask a question in a forum and get this, you're doing it wrong. Next up, Don't Be an Asshole. This is a book called The No Asshole Rule. Who's heard of this book? Some hands. Who's read it? Some hands. Okay, good. This was written by a researcher at Stanford, and I pardon the language, but apparently it's a technical organizational dynamics research term now. He actually goes at some length into the book talking about why he felt it was important to use the word asshole. And he said, if we water it down and say the no jerks rule or the no negative Nancy rule, it takes away from the impact that the discussion has about what these people do to other people and how those people feel. So he uses that word throughout the book. I was trying to get a count of how many times he uses the word in the book. This is not being an asshole. The old eunuch's neckbeard from Dilbert. He's very specific about and narrow in his definition of that. And that's important. So this may be hard to read, but he provides two tests. One of them is after talking to the alleged, or test one is after talking to the alleged asshole, does the target feel oppressed, humiliated, de-energized, or belittled by the person? And in particular, does the target feel worse about him or herself? And test two is, does the alleged asshole aim his or her venom at people who are less powerful rather than those who are more powerful? If your organization allows this, you should buy this book and give it to someone upstairs. This is not cheap. There's some interesting quotations. He goes into more detail, but there are a couple I wanted to bring up. They're talking about a CEO who had personally criticized lots of the employees, and they said that the middle management revealed, of course anonymously, that behavior robbed the company of talent it needed to maintain quality operations. One set of researchers tried to estimate the TCA, total cost of asshole, for one person at a company for 1 year. The bill came out to $160,000. They factored in all of the legal fees, all of HR's time dealing with this, all the CEOs, like HR talking to the management, all of those people's time. And so this costs real money. Now, we all have bad days. The book makes a distinction between temporary asshole and certified asshole, which apparently are technical terms. So we've all probably been temporary assholes at one point or another. We'll talk more about that in a sec. And finally, self-awareness. I don't mean this in the clinical sense of the word, where your dog barks at the mirror, because in that sense we are all self-aware. I mean it in this sense. How many engineering meetings has Hanger ruined? Right? Do you get an engineering meeting right before lunch? And then around 11, or actually maybe right now, right? You know, like, I want to go have dinner. So it took me about into my 20s to realize, like, I kept being an asshole, actually, to people and friends in the mornings. And it was because, well, I'd grab a cup of coffee and go to work because I was in a rush. And it took me a while to realize there was a reason for that. Oftentimes, one way that I like to think about self-awareness is a watchdog timer. Any like old hardware hackers, Cisco routers used to have this little hardware thing, and then the OS would poke it. And if the OS ever hung, then the hardware timer would reset it, right? And so there's sort of this background thing that's sort of checking to see what's going on. We had the MountainWest JS before us. It's like that dialogue that comes up. It's like, u.com/beinganasshole.js is taking too long. Would you like to continue? Yes or no? I actually have started like thinking about it as there's like this little voice back here going, "You're being an asshole. You need to stop it." Couple of, so Hanger is kind of an interesting one. It took me a while to realize that. But they're actually real stories here, and this happens to us more often than I think a lot of us realize, certainly for me. Have you ever had a really passionate technical argument with someone, and then you realized after it was over, you're like, I didn't really care that much? When I was in my first job, I had a really, really good friend, and he was just out of school, and I'd been working there for a couple of years. I said, hey, come work at the company with me. And so he was there for summer as an intern, and we hung out all the time, and we played video games and stuff. And we had a fight one night, so we left, and we were angry at each other and that whole thing. And the next day, we had a build team meeting, and we were talking about third-party source management, which is an important topic, but not the most exciting topic. And so we're there with the entire build team, he and I, and we start arguing with each other. And what's funny is we're having the same argument with the same energy about the argument that we had last night. We drug it into the meeting, but all couched in terms about patch management and third-party open source licenses. And the meeting ended, people left, and my mentor stayed back with me, and he was like, you guys both really care about this third-party source stuff. And in the meeting, there was nothing here going, hey, you're being a jerk, stop it. So, this is being realized in the industry. This was an article recently, Empathy as a Core Engineering Value, is a core engineering value, and there's links to a post discussing that. This kind of harks back to don't be an asshole, but it's hard to be empathetic when you're sort of unclear on what's going on within yourself. When you're kind of like, I'm acting a way that I don't usually act, and your voice is like, what's going on? And you can't really answer it. So, that's VIDs. So let's talk about how does this fit? We define DevOps as culture, automation, sharing, metrics. I got this triangles backwards, but that's okay. Well, so if you actually categorize these, obviously putting CDs into trays on thousands of servers detracts from value. So automation clearly goes in the value column. And so it also, when we look at automation, it talks about it's optimizing how we actually deliver bits, which is what continuous delivery pipelines are actually all about. That's their whole purpose, is optimizing that process. Sharing, obviously internally addressing how stuff flows between dev and ops and those teams and how that stuff works. Clearly that's part of that. Individuality, metrics allows us to get the data that we need to be able to react to complex and complicated systems. Because we can't rely on best practices, merely good ones. So sharing also becomes critical in that, because we need to be able to communicate about what the possible good practices solutions are. And then obviously on the don't be an asshole and self-awareness, culture is a huge factor in that. If you read the Phoenix Project, they talk about the first way, second way, and third way of DevOps. If you haven't read the Phoenix Project, you should go read the Phoenix Project. So if we stick that into the model, systems thinking is necessary to map value. Optimizing feedback loops, that's the second way, same sort of thing. That's about looking at the value stream. In individuality, to be able, in complicated systems, the model for looking at that stuff is sense, analyze, response. So we actually have to amplify the feedback loops, which is the second way. And then again, of course, a learning organization understands that its systems are complex and complicated, so there isn't an obvious solution. They're not going to try to shoehorn a best practice because they know that's not going to work. The third way also talks a lot about fault injection, which you get into with complicated and emergent systems. Obviously, for Don't Be an Asshole, the third way talks about becoming a learning culture, which says it's okay to fail and making that not something that you can be blamed for or fired for. So obviously, that's part of Don't Be an Asshole. And then, of course, for organizations, when you talk about self-awareness at the organizational level, like what does that actually mean? Well, it turns out that that's actually systems thinking. Because it's an example of where you've got, maybe dev says, oh, I need to change the version of Ubuntu we're using, and they don't tell ops that until they try to deploy it, it fails, right? And so it's one of those when the developer says, oh, I'm going to change the version of the JDK. There's something back there going, and I should tell those guys. It turns out that you can map this stuff to other areas too. So this is the 5 values of extreme programming: communication, simplicity, feedback, respect, courage. They map into this too. So communication, obviously, its impact on the value stream is pretty obvious. Simplicity, again, optimizing the value stream, so not building stuff that we're not going to use. Feedback is basically an example of sharing, so you've got that in there. I actually didn't put feedback into individuality, but again, it's an example. In the complex space, you probe, sense, respond. So that's where the feedback is relevant, because you're probing something and then you need to sense how it responds, and then so you can respond. Other Don't Be an Asshole. Respect, obviously, that's pretty obvious. Courage, you need that to actually stand up to people who are doing that in your environment. And what's interesting is under the self-awareness part, Kent Beck actually had a quote where he's like, Optimism is an occupational hazard of programming. Feedback is the treatment. So it's one of those things, we've all done this, where it's like we all sit in the room and we say, this is totally going to ship on spec and on time. And in the background, our self-awareness is going, not going to happen. And so that's extreme program. That's how it tries to solve these areas. You can take Agile's 4 values. People over tools and process, working software over documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. You can map them in. On the value stream, valuing actually working software over write-only wikis, documentation that nobody reads. Again, valuing individuals over process. Because there's, maybe multiple good solutions, and responding to change over following a plan, because again, we're talking about complex, complicated systems. In the Don't Be an Asshole, I didn't put it on there, but the valuing customer interactions over contract negotiation, because some people think a contract is an excuse to be an asshole, but so you could put that in there too. The SD stands for Scrum. And so obviously, if you're going to be aware of the system around you, Scrum is a way to actually let teams communicate and let people, by just standing there, absorb what's happening with the system around them. So there's a bit of a self-awareness with that. And we've all had this, right, where we're talking about, this solves I said this was 2 story points. And again, the self-awareness is like, not 2 story points. We're like 12. And you can actually do it with, I promise this is the last one, you can do it with Lean IT, where they talk about value streams and value stream mapping and flow and pull demand systems. Obviously, the value stream mapping stuff fits clearly in the value realignment space. Flow causes people to shift away from best practices to just-in-time for what the organization actually needs. And then, of course, flow relates to being aware of the system's, the organization's own limitations. And pull demand tries to address those things. So so that got a little crazy at the end, that whole little graph with all those little dots and stuff. But trying to answer the question, what's the derivative of DevOps? And I think the answer is vids. It turns out it's the same. It's also the derivative of XP and Agile and Scrum and Lean IT. So has DevOps jumped the shark? I don't know. What's next? So you hear a lot of talk about this concept of flow or ops flow. Is it like sales, finance, build, DevOps, Dev, QA, ops all smushed together? Is it enterprise DevOps, the next generation? Is it magical unicorns and rainbows working together to develop software? I don't know. What I do know is that whatever it is, it's highly likely to involve these four things: value realignment, individuality, don't be an asshole, self-awareness, and systems thinking. And if we all strive towards getting good at these in ourselves and in our companies, we'll build better software, we'll operate our services more adeptly, we'll be better to each other, and that's an industry I want to live in, and I hope you do too. Thanks.